Welcome to the Week Ahead podcast by SBM Intelligence. I'm your host, Veronica Pana Igube. Every Friday, we explore stories that are shaping our continent. Oba Ewuare II of Benin rejected the introduction of the Iyaloja title in Edo market, insisting that the palace recognizes Iyeki remains the traditional market leader and that the Iyaloja concept is foreign to Benin culture. Could this reflect growing friction between tradition and modern political influence? The AfDB approved a 500 million loan to support Nigeria's fiscal and power reforms, while the CBN has introduced stricter agent banking rules, including a 1.2 million naira daily cash out limit and real-time settlements. Does this move reflect renewed confidence in Nigeria's reform and economic stability efforts? Côte d'Ivoire has banned protests over the exclusion of opposition figures from the October 25th presidential election as the current president seeks a fourth term. Will this move deepen political tensions in the country? Joining us today for further insight is Ayotunde Abiodun, an analyst at SBM Intelligence. Welcome, Ayo, to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Veronica. It's always a pleasure to be here.
It's always a pleasure to have you as well. Let's start with our first story. So we see the Oba of Benin reject the Iyaloja title. This week we saw that there was kind of like a coronation, if I'll put it that way, or the introduction of the Iyaloja title in Benin. And the Oba of Benin has stated that this is foreign to the Benin culture and it's not going to be accepted. So he has practically rejected it. What are your thoughts on the whole issue? I mean, with the installation of the Iyaloja in Edo, why do you think it's moving from kind of like something that is big in Lagos and Western states, and it's now going into Edo State? And do you think that this rejection as well from the Benin people um, shows kind of like an ongoing tension between culture preservation and political influence in Nigeria?
All right, thank you so much for your question. I think the first thing I'll say is that this development vividly signals that the political season is off to a start. So all of these are gimmicks towards 2027 elections, and it just shows that every actor in the political scene are already trying to put structures in place to safeguard their interests ahead of 2027 election. So what we see play out in Benin over the past week just shows that there will always be desperation in the political scene. We're going to see desperate steps to do things that have not been done before in a bid to put in structures that will help secure their interests ahead of 2027 election. So we must understand that market associations are big components. Yeah, it's a big base for electioneering in this country. So um, it's not a surprise that we're seeing this kind of play out within that space. But having said that, we need to understand that the Oba's rejection highlights the delicate balance that Nigeria faces between maintaining its indigenous cultural structures and then accommodating modern political interests. Um, Institutions like the Oba of Benin are custodians of century-old practices, and what the Oba did was right. He had to resist it. It was completely like alien to the Edo people. And so it just shows that as much as our political actors are going to put one or two gimmicks into play. They should not, they should ensure that political ambitions do not override established cultural governance, because in the long run, it's going to cause more tension than any gain they seek to gain from it. Because it's a thing of you trying to downplay people culture, sort of. The Iyeki traditional role in the Benin market system is one that is renowned and has played out for a long time. And then all of a sudden, you want to install a new system. Definitely, that's going to get resistance, and that's what we've seen. And the Benin people will be glad that their Oba basically resisted this move, because one of the things we need to also point out is that over the past few years, in terms of our democratic growth, we've seen the what's the word to use, kind of declining influence of traditional institution, especially like the traditional leaders. We've seen their declining influence, especially when you consider that within states there are offices such as Commissioner for Local Government and Chieftaincy Affairs, basically thus making the whole thing politicized. So this development in Benin basically shows why we need those traditional institutions to still exist, so that they can preserve the cultural governance structures of indigenous people. Right. So I think this covers the first bit of your question.
I agree with you, but also, do you think that, I mean, let me kind of play devil's advocate here. It's like, on the one hand, right, do you think that it's also kind of saying we are a large country, there are a lot of Yorubas that have moved into Edo State. Do you think that there's also a kind of, I know you mentioned like it's political as well, we're coming into the political season, but isn't there, do you think there's also a space for religious tolerance or cultural tolerance as it is, to say both can operate side by side? Do you think that both can operate side by side, or do you think it will be like a kind of elimination of the Iyaki's traditional role in Benin, the Benin market system? Um, what's your thoughts?
So my thought will be that we should respect indigenous setups and governance structures anywhere. I don't think we should make a case for them running side by side. I think because of the political nature of the move, we understand that there's going to be an attempt to basically take over, and in the long run, that's going to cause more tensions and more harm than any intended gain. So I think cultural tolerance in itself is not not making this move at all in the first place. If the actors responsible really valued cultural tolerance in a country that's already being threatened with a lot of ethnic bigotry and clashes. And that move should not have been carried out in the first place. That's my opinion. I think that's cultural tolerance in itself, where you respect institutions that have existed for so long in certain places.
And lastly, on this, what do you think the pulse of the people of Benin or Edo State, like, did you think that they were also shocked or didn't understand why this is happening because they already had their existing system? Are there oppositions coming as well from the people rejecting, this system in line with that of the Oba of Benin's thought?
Yeah, so the report has been that the people of Edo are backing their monarch in this move. We've seen report that the market women in Benin have expressed solidarity with the monarch over this whole development, and I think that's the expected reaction. We cannot just take people's cultural governance structures that have existed for years. We can just take them for granted and say we're trying to install a new setup which is completely foreign, because again it just shows the, so the Iyaloja title has never existed in the states, and all of a sudden you want to do that when they already have the Iyeki responsible for that kind of a thing. So, and we also need to understand something that plays out in our political scene, not just in our political scene, it really extends to our governance scene, to be honest. When things are not done like with due process, we don't do basic consultations. So one of the things the monarch said in his report, because I saw like a full-blown statement from the office of the Oba of Benin, was to the effect that there were no power consultations before that move was carried out. So it just shows that these people's interests were never expected or weighted in the first place. So uh, this is a good development in my opinion. This basically set counts as a precedent sort of, that if something of this nature is going to be tried in other regions or in other states, there's going to be pushback or consult and then persuaded them as to the effect of why that structure should come into place in the first place. So that's my thoughts on it.
I mean, I do agree with you as well. And, in the statement of the Oba of Benin as well, was like the power of consultation is key because if they had done that, then they would have known that right from the start, this wouldn't work as well. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on that. So we can move on to our next story, where we're having the discussion about the AfDB loan to Nigeria and CBN's new banking rules. How will this $500 million loan and the Nigerians' recent banking reform kind of shape our investment confidence and fiscal stability in the coming months? Because I mean, Nigerians are clamoring for our economy to be better as well. So with this money coming in and the banking reforms, you think we're gonna see in the next few months, a kind of change or a progression in our economy?
All right, that's a brilliant question to start. So what I think is that this loan from the African Development Bank gives Nigeria some form of confidence, right? It signals international confidence in Nigeria's economic management. So we need to pay attention to the fact, or just drag back our mind to the fact that lots of reforms have been carried out by the current administration over the last 2 years. And there have been a lot of reports from international organizations that these reforms are on the right track, but the issue has been that Nigerians have not seen the dividends of such. So, and then getting a loan of this magnitude from the African Development Bank just shows that there's a form of international confidence in how Nigeria is currently managing its economy, right? So, and again, I think Nigerians need to understand that the nature of reforms that were carried out were not necessarily prosperity returns, right? They were crisis management reforms. For instance, the first subsidy has to be stopped because it was no longer favorable for the Nigerian government to continue paying. They basically didn't have that resources any longer. And then the depreciation of the naira too was also something that was no longer, they had to depreciate the naira because they could no longer sustain the previous current value. So, and we've not seen a lot of messaging as to really align Nigerians understand that, and those crisis management form of reforms are going to really take time before they can yield like great results. So I need to state that. But I think it signals that to the Nigerian government that things are looking to go up. And I think that the resources, the 500 million, provides crucial fiscal space for government priorities. And if you couple this with the current banking reforms, banks are trying to recapitalize all in a bid to support a $1 trillion economy. It signals an intention from the Nigerian government to basically improve financial governance, right? And for investors who are looking to, who are basically watching the Nigerian space as to whether they should enter the market or not, I think this loan from the African Development Bank kind of reassure them that maybe Nigeria is just nearing towards stability, right? And so we'll have to wait to see how that will pan out. But I think the crucial thing that needs to be said is that the impact will definitely rely on how these resources are deployed and whether the reforms are sustained beyond short-term optics. So those are my thoughts on that.
Okay, lastly on this, the CBN also has, included new rules to tighten agent bank operations. What effect do you think that these would have on financial inclusion? Because we're trying to close that gap to, address the unbanked or get the unbanked banked, as they say, especially in the rural areas.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think I will just try to give a rundown on this new agent banking guidelines that was released by the CBN. So basically, this new guideline makes for a comprehensive guideline because it consolidates all the previous regulations into a single document and then introduce some stricter operational requirements that will fundamentally impact how millions of Nigerians who rely on these agent banking services would basically operate. Some of the changes are the fact that one, it handed multi-bank agencies. So before, agent could play for different principals. So principals in this context refer to banks or fintech companies. So you had agent who could be or someone utilizing money points, another the same person utilizing OP terminals and all of those things. But what this new guideline says is that agent must now be exclusive to one principal. So the idea is, I think, is to like give it more structure to the market and basically help in terms of monitoring, right? But uh, the impact in that sense would be how agents who had relied on these multiple sources of earnings, right? And in terms of like customer convenience, because they have different options for customer preferences. So the case is now how with these agents basically fit into this new system, basically. And the CBN is arguing that this is to help improve accountability and to also reduce fraud. Another thing that was made was transaction limits. So now the daily cash out by an agent is 1.2 million naira, and then individual customers have a limit of 100,000 naira a day, and then 500,000 naira weekly. And again, this is some form of restriction, right? Because some Nigerians depend on more than those cash flows. So how will they source for this money, basically, right? So while we understand that all of these new requirements are to combat stuffs like money laundering and fraud, so there's a fear that it might drive some transactions back underground. So we might just see like a lot of transactions, informal transactions, go back to the underground because of all of this. And I think another important requirement I must state is that that there are geographical restrictions now. So devices, um, these point of sales terminals, they now must be geo-fenced so as to operate only at registered agent locations. So again, that practice where you had agents that could conduct business across multiple locations, right? So they could migrate to different areas just to serve it needs. That would change, right? Because these devices will now be geofenced to operate at a registered location. So this again might bring in some problems because what happens where that flexibility that was offered to Nigerians as a service no longer exists, and what now happens in places that have like poor GPS accuracy. So there are, as much as the guidelines tries to like put certain things in place, right? There are still a lot of things that not be sorted structurally for these guidelines to really be effective. And I think that the CBN should be open enough to see how these new guidelines should roll out and play, and then be willing to immediately step in and then tweak certain things as the development occur because we cannot downplay the importance of agents banking in the country today. It has basically serviced a large number of Nigerians who initially did not have access to a traditional banking system. So while we understand that there's a need to enhance accountability, reduce fraud, and then strengthen the credibility of the banking system, we also must be careful not to limit the already sort of limited access that these rural areas already enjoy. So the CBN must be careful enough to strike the right balance, right? So we need to ensure that whatever security measures we want to achieve does not inadvertently disenfranchise underserved populations who rely on these services for their daily transactions. I'll hand it there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you with, when you said to push a lot of transactions underground. Also, it may look as if we're losing that flexibility of being able to use your point of service at any point or any place, as opposed to, but on the bright side, you look at it addressing fraud as well. And it's easier to trace when someone has done something as well illegal with their transactions, and it will curb money laundering, which was, I mean, the advantage outweighs the disadvantage as well. But I mean, as you put it, rightly put, the guidelines still also needs to address those structural issues to ensure that it also doesn't form a disadvantage to the unbanked. Thank you very much, Ayo, for that. Let's go to our final story where we see in Côte d'Ivoire, they have banned election protest rallies. Um, Over I think the few months right now, we've been seeing a lot of protests in different countries. Um, why does the Côte d'Ivoire's decision to ban protests, what does it reveal about the political state and the political freedom ahead of their October 25th elections?
So interestingly, the development in Cote d'Ivoire just keeps pursuing me because I remember the last time I was on the podcast, we were discussing the outcome of the Constitutional Council banning key opposition figures from
Yeah.
participating in the election, right? And then what we see now is an extension of that outcome where we've seen a lot of protest rallies, especially in the capital, Abidjan. So there've been a lot of protests on the streets against the ban of key opposition figures that were not allowed to run in the election. So the election is about 3 weeks from now, 25th of October. And because the government has been seeing a lot of protest rallies, it has now banned election protest rallies. So what this signals is that there's a contraction of the political space and it raises concerns about the freedom of expression and assembly. People have the right to express themselves, and protest is a constitutionally recognized way of expression. And also, it counts as the right to assemble and then express collectively as a group. So, as much as the authorities in Cote d'Ivoire want to justify this and say, oh, security grounds, it clearly limits the opposition's ability to mobilize and to communicate with voters, right? So, understanding that ordinarily voters are already against the situation in the country because it felt like a clear attempt by the incumbent government to use the instrument of the state to sideline the key challengers in that election. And this just basically highlights the fragility of democratic freedom in the country. And my fear, as I said the last time I was on the podcast, is that uh, everything seems to favor the correct incumbent. Ouattara is most likely going to win that election because everything just seems to be in his favor, right? But my fear is, are we going to see post-election tensions? And as much as this ban has been effected, Are we going to see the people comply and not come out to mobilize themselves and protest? Or in the instance they still defy this ban, are we going to see the force of the state come down on them through security agencies? So there's a lot of tension in the air right now for Côte d'Ivoire, and it's also important to put in that currently a lot of what we qualify as reforms are currently playing out in the country, especially in terms of like the extractive sectors. There are a lot of investment coming into the mining sector in Côte d'Ivoire, and also considering how they are the biggest producer of cocoa in the world. So strategically, Côte d'Ivoire is important to the world, especially for chocolate cocoa lovers, right? So investors who would ordinarily want to come in and play in these sectors and by extension help improve the situation in the country are going to be wary because political risk stops the nature of risks that it remains to be seen whether or not we would see post-election crisis in Cote d'Ivoire. And when you extend that to the history Cote d'Ivoire has, especially when it comes to elections, it's not so good because over the past years we've seen election crisis tear into civil wars. So it's just a really dicey situation in Cote d'Ivoire right now.
I mean, it's a sad situation, but I mean, just like you said, is like there's so many things to expect. Are we going to see post-election tensions? Are we also going to see citizens defy this ban and still come out and protest? But one thing importantly, what do you think the people are going to do? Are they going to come out in their numbers to vote to ensure that, the preferred candidate that will take their country forward will be elected? Or do you think that you're just gonna, it's just gonna increase voter apathy for voters to just say, you know what, I'm not even coming to vote if my vote doesn't count? What do you think there's a possibility of seeing?
So this is a very interesting question because voters' attitude is always hard to predict, right? So what you expect is that in a situation whereby the incumbent has utilized state institutions for his favor ahead of an election season, it will typically lead to like voters' apathy, right? Especially when the key opposition figures that had the political clout, like TJ and Tiham, are already out. So it makes a case that a lot of or these opposition supporters might just sit out the election. And in the instance where there's a low turnout, it automatically favors the incumbents, right? But again, it remains to be seen whether Ivorians can channel this already shown frustration and then maybe just look for another decent opposition candidate and then extend those votes too. So it remains to be seen how they will react, right? But from history, a more predictable outcome may be that there will be a low turnout in the election. So there might be just be an instance whereby opposition voters will come out to protest why the election is ongoing because the necessary might not vote, right? And then post-election, they will contest the result, go back to the street to protest. So voters' attitude is really something history a more predictable outcome would be that there'll be a low turnout on the election day, which automatically favors the incumbent governor president to win, and it remains to be seen what nature of post-election crisis will play out.
Thank you very much, Ayo, for joining us on the podcast today and for sharing your thoughts. Well appreciated. Thank you.
Always a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
To all our listeners, this podcast is by SBM Intelligence. You can access our podcast by searching for SBM Intelligence anywhere you find podcasts. For deeper insights into our work, visit our website at sbmintel.com. Remember to connect with us on all our social media platforms. You can find us on X, Facebook, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn at SBM Intelligence. That's all for today. Thank you very much for listening.